This. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture. So I'm honored to introduce our guest lecturer today, Dr. Mojd Resulzadeh. She is assistant professor in the Department of the Mathematics and adjunct faculty at the Mechanical Engineering Department at the University of Alabama. And his talk today is about transport phenomena in porous media. So I'm pretty sure that would be very interesting talk for us. And usually the talk is for 1 hour, and after that, for 20 minutes, we have discussion. So before I give the presentation to Dr. Resulzadeh, I really appreciate if you mute yourself if you don't have any question or you don't ask any questions. So this way she can communicate well. So Dr. Resulzadeh, this is yours, and welcome again to UDC.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to my talk. Thanks a lot, Reza, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my research with you. I'm very excited to be with you guys today. So my talk will be about anomalous transport in porous media with embedded cavity, but it will be like 90% of my talk talking about deriving the flow equations in a medium with embedded cavities. I had several collaborators in this work, Dr. Fikri Kuchuk from Schlumberger Dahl Research Center and Hang Deng from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and also John White, my student. All these collaborators helped me to elaborate more on this topic during the past years. I am, as you know, an assistant faculty in the Department of Mathematics and adjunct faculty in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. So to give you an idea, where is Tuscaloosa? Tuscaloosa is in the state of Alabama, and it will take you 12 hours drive to get from where you are to our campus. So we have a beautiful campus located at the south of the Black Warrior River. We have a very nice quad located almost at the center of campus. My office is 5 minutes walk to the quad, and right in front of my office on the other side of the street is the Office of Geological Survey of Alabama. On our campus, we have the one and only National Water Center located on our campus. So the overall ambience of the research in our campus is mostly water related. So surface water, subsurface water research is very common between faculty at the UA. We have Alabama Water Institute and several research centers for water-related researches. Also, you may know our university through the college football. This is our great coach, Nick Saban. You may know him. We never stopped the football, even during the pandemic, as you can see here. Tuscaloosa has a population about 100,000 people. And on game days, we host almost about the same number of people in town. So town gets double in size on game days, and then again everything goes back to normal. This is our stadium, and in front of this stadium, at the entrance on the ground, you can see the memorials for national championships. And now, after 18 national championships, actually, there is no more room to put more stones on the ground, and we should find a way to enlarge the place. So with this introduction, let me tell you about what I want to talk with you about today. So I want to present my work about single-phase flow in porous medium, but not a normal porous media. First of all, a porous media is what involves the flow in porous media is the simplest fluid dynamics problem in which we basically do not need to solve Navier-Stokes equation. We are actually solving the Stokes equation at porous scale, and we upscale it, and we obtain the Darcy's law, which is the simplest relation between the velocity and pressure gradient. Darcy's law says that velocity is direct proportional to the pressure gradient through a coefficient of proportionality, which is called the permeability. The size of the pore volume in the portion of the pore volume in the porous media is called the porosity. Darcy's law, together with the momentum balance equation, mass balance equation, gives us the diffusion equation, what we call it diffusion equation, or in mathematics we call it a parabolic partial differential equation. Solving this differential equation actually is very, very classic, and there are I just put a picture of a handbook for that. So there are handbooks to solve diffusion equation, which is not physically diffusion as we know it in chemical engineering. It's the structure of the equation, which is very similar to heat equation or diffusion for the transport of chemical species. So porous media is very easy. This easy problem immediately becomes a complicated problem when the pore space distribution is not uniform along the domain. Here I included several images of different applications. For example, in a thin film composite membrane, the pore size distribution is not uniform in the domain. Yeah, as you can see, this light gray zone is where we have nano scale pores, and in which the microscale pores are embedded randomly in the domain. So still we are working with a porous media, but the porous media has different pore sizes from one location to another. So basically it's a multimodal pore size distribution, as you can see here. In subsurface, yes.
Quick, is it okay to ask questions in the middle, or should we?
Sure, it is more than okay.
Okay, just a very quick question. So I see where the del dot K or mu gradient P, that's a del dot V. What is C again?
Compressibility. Some domains can be, we have compressibility in terms of the medium compressibility, and we have compressibility in terms of the slightly compressible fluid.
Okay, understood.
So
Great.
we bring it into the equations here. I just skipped that. We can put all into porosity to just think about the porosity.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
You're welcome. So another example of the porous medium with embedded cavities is the carbonate formations, the karst aquifers, which provide the drinking water to half of the population of the world. And in those formations, we again see that the porous rock structure is not uniform, and we can see the pore size distribution varying in orders of magnitude from one location to another. Same thing in shale formations. As you can see, the organic matter can be distributed like in embedded inclusions in the shale formation. So some sponge-shaped organic matter inclusions, or just bubble-shaped, so filled with organic matter. So we may see these inclusions like porous inclusions, or just the void cavity filled with organic matter or fluid. So once we deal with this kind of porous media problem, we basically have the spatial properties of domain varying from the background to the embedded cavity. That is something that numerically taking care of that will be relatively complicated, since we need to represent the cavity in our model, and we need to show how the interface will be different from one location to another. So we basically need to have a grid or a model representative with respect to the cavity. That is the first challenge. And on the other side, we need to look into the overall off-scale model for the media So we are dealing with a large scale problem, and at micro scale problem, we need to.
Dr. Nisha, I think your microphone is on.
This is something that numerically will be very expensive to take care of. So we need a grid that is representative with respect to the larger scale media, and also a grid that is representative with respect to each of these embedded cavities in the domain. So here's the point that we thought maybe if we can improve our modeling approach to become to be capable of modeling the cavities through some, for example, analytical modeling, that will be helpful to avoid the gridding challenges and computational efforts that are required for this step. So what is available in the literature for modeling the flow in a porous medium with embedded cavities? So in subsurface flow modeling, I can tell you most of the time we neglect the cavities. So no one talks about it. We say it's homogeneous and we move forward. Some researchers, a lot of researchers also, they take care of the cavities in terms of replacing cavities with porous inclusions. So we know that this cavity is a fluid-filled cavity filled with fluid and is non-porous, but we replaced it with a porous media of very high porosity and porosity 1 and very high permeability. And then we use an approach like multi-continuum approach, in which we say at each spatial location we have porous matrix and cavity coexisting together, and they exchange fluid with each other. The challenge comes here where how to define this fluid exchange between these two media. That's the big question here. Some researchers, they use the same approach that we use for fractured porous media, and they say the fluid exchange between the matrix and the cavity is proportional to the pressure difference between the two of them, and they consider it as a pseudo-steady state fluid exchange. In reality, we know that this fluid exchange is way more complicated than just a simple pseudo-steady state term. Let me explain through these two shapes what we are missing here. If we replace a fluid-filled cavity with a porous inclusion, we are basically replacing the Stokes flow in the cavity by Darcy law in the porous inclusion. So what will happen, Darcy law is a linear law. So as you can see here, and as I will show through my analytical results today to you, the streamlines in a fluid-filled cavity are somehow deviated toward the main axis of the cavity. But in a porous inclusion, the streamlines are straight. So if I replace a fluid-filled cavity with a porous inclusion, I am behind the scenes telling you that the full porous domain is participating in the overall flow. But as you can see here, it is possible, based on how the flow will happen inside the cavity, to have some vorticities showing up. And these vorticities actually are removing a portion of cavity from the overall flow. So basically, I have a big cavity, but just a part of it is participating in the flow, and the remainder is removed from the flow. And the other challenge here is, once I decide to replace my cavity with a porous inclusion, what should be that very high permeability that I'm assigning to this shape? Should it be 2 orders of magnitude higher than the matrix host, or 3 orders magnitude? How should I select that? So that's also another big challenge to go through this approach of multi-continuum approach. There are other approaches like homogenization theory, which is based on the mathematical homogenization, which still needs a lot of numerical effort. And also there is another approach like Darcy-Brinkman-Stokes model, in which we use one single model to describe what happens in porous matrix and what happens in the cavity. And by adjusting the parameters of this model, we switch from Stokes flow to Darcy flow. But the thing is that on the interface, we are missing lots of information because the switching on the interface will be very smooth from Stokes to Darcy law. And then we miss information exactly on interface sharp. So Darcy-Brinkman model is a little bit tricky. And if we are interested in, for example, how the dissolution will take place at this interface of the cavity and the matrix, then we may miss that information through a Brinkman model. Now that I'm talking about the dissolution, let me tell you, for example, in a reactive system, what is happening here? So we have the chemical reactions taking place, and then the solute transport is going to carry out the mineral that are already dissolved by the bulk fluid velocity. So the bulk fluid velocity, it is important whether it is described through a Darcy law or a Stokes flow. If the bulk fluid velocity is different in the cavity, it will be different at the interface. We will have a jump in the velocity, and the full structure of solute transport will be different, and this will affect the effective reaction rates at the interface. So in this talk today, I will also show you how this different description of velocity in the cavity can affect the effective reaction rate in a reactive transport system. Before everything, let's go through the flow description and tell you what I'm doing here. So here, what I'm doing, I have a cavity located at the center of a porous matrix, and I'm solving the Stokes equation in the cavity and Darcy flow in the outside of the cavity in the matrix. We approximate the shape of cavity by a spheroid. The spheroid has the advantage that by playing with parameters of spheroid, we can have a sphere, we can have an elongated rod, and we can have a disc. So it covers rather a good variety of shapes of cavities that we may see in a porous medium, just with playing with the aspect ratio of the minor axis of the spheroid to its major axis. So we write the equations of flow in and outside of the cavity, and we couple them through a set of boundary conditions. The boundary condition is not very straightforward. We use the no jump condition on the normal stress, which implicitly includes a jump in pressure. We use the no jump condition on normal velocity and a slip condition because we have kind of free flow inside the cavity and the Darcy law outside the cavity. So we expect to have some slip condition at the interface. This slip condition is traditionally given by Beavers-Joseph boundary condition. That boundary condition is given for the cases that the interface is a straight line. So in our model, since the cavity has a curved shape at the interface, we used the modified Beavers-Joseph boundary condition introduced by Jones in 1973. And using the modified Beavers-Joseph boundary condition, we can see that the equivalent permeability of the cavity will be a little bit higher compared to the case that we just used classical Beavers-Joseph boundary condition. And the difference is not negligible. So we go with the modified Beavers-Joseph boundary condition. Writing the Stokes equation in the cavity in terms of the stream functions, we end up with a fourth order partial differential equation And for the pressure field in the matrix, we will have a second order Laplace equation. We solve each of them separately in using the spheroidal coordinate system. The advantage of spheroidal coordinate system is that I can describe this interface by just using one fixed parameter in the spheroidal system. And these two equations, I can solve them analytically. So that is the most important thing that I want to actually show you here today, that once I solve these equations, I have the flow, the stream function, and velocity like analytically everywhere without doing any grading effort. So the solution is given in terms of some eigenfunction expansion using the eigenfunctions of each of the partial differential equations that I have. The details of all these derivations is published in Transport in Porous Media. I included this here for your information if you're interested to see how the solution is derived. And then once I know the pressure in the porous matrix and stream functions in the cavity, I can obtain velocity and pressure in each of them, and then I can apply boundary conditions to obtain all the undetermined coefficients in the solution. So applying the boundary condition is a little bit tricky here because we are working with a very complex set of boundary conditions, which is even numerically solving that is very challenging. So, but still, we were able to obtain the analytical solution for all of these cases. Before I show you the results, let me tell you about the case in which the cavity is not a fluid-filled non-porous cavity. It is a porous inclusion. And so in that case, we will have Darcy law in the cavity and in the matrix, and coupling them will be very straightforward since we are just solving two Laplace equations in each of the domain, and we couple through a no-jump boundary condition on pressure and flux through the interface. This is important since sometimes we have the porous inclusions with porosity and permeability orders of magnitude different from the host matrix. And also it is important since we can use this to replace the fluid-filled cavity with a porous inclusion, but this time we require the porous inclusion to create the exact same pressure field in the matrix as if we have a fluid-filled cavity. So with that, we obtain what we call it the equivalent permeability for a fluid-filled cavity, which the external impact of it will be exactly same as the fluid-filled cavity. So here are my results. As you can see here on the left column, I have the porous inclusions. So what you see in the inside this red curve is a porous inclusion with relatively high permeability. The inclusion shape is spherical or a more elongated spheroid. And on the right three columns, you can see the stream functions for the case where we have fluid-filled cavities. Here I'm playing with the slip condition at the interface. As you can see here, the stream lines are rather continuous at the interface, and when increasing the slip, the stream lines are a little bit deviated, and you can see that vortices start forming as the slip is more important. And again, you can see here for a more elongated shape of the cavity, how the vortices start forming earlier. So, and once again, I want to emphasize that these are all analytical results. So no numerical work was performed until here. And now we have pressure, velocity, all analytically available. At each grid point, we can just evaluate those functions that return these velocities. The first thing we can do, we can put them all together. So since we are in an incompressible fluid system, we can superpose the pressure field and velocity field and obtain a combination of multiple cavities in the system. So that is the first exciting advantage of this approach. With the least effort, we can locate cavities here and there and see how the flow field will be in a complex system of several cavities. As you can see here, we can obtain the effective permeability of such a system. So since we know the velocity field everywhere, we can average the velocity field and divide it by external pressure gradient and obtain what is the effective permeability of this system. There are few other tools like Maxwell theory that they can also approximate the effective permeability of a system of porous inclusions embedded in a matrix domain. But those theories, they are based on very simplistic approximations. For example, they assume that all the inclusions are located at the center, and they neglect what is the interference between the different inclusions. So, for example, in between the two inclusions, the fluid wants on one side to go through the general direction of the flow and also wants to be to pass through the easier way, which has less resistance in front of the fluid. So this is also creating an additional resistance for fluid. As you can see here, the Maxwell theory, which is the dashed line here, is kind of overestimating the effective permeability compared to our model. So our model is capable to take into account what is happening, like the interference between different cavities. Also, as you can see, the effective permeability of the domain will be reduced because of the more important slip condition at the interface. But overall, I can tell you that the effective permeability is mainly a function of volume fraction of the VOGs. And also, if you have same volume fraction, if the number of the cavities if it is distributed between more number of cavities, then we will have an improved effective permeability compared to having, for example, one single cavity with the same volume fraction. So these are informations that, for example, in designing for example, porous layers for membranes, these are the informations that we can use to somehow tailor the pore morphology of those membranes to get a better, efficiency of that membrane. So talking about membranes, how about now that we know what is the velocity everywhere, we look into the transport problem. Let's transport a non-reactive species in this domain and see what will happen. So when I wanted to answer this question, I started using an open source because I had to solve an advection diffusion equation, and what I had was not capable of solving this analytically. So I was thinking of using an open source code. I used Moose by Idaho National Lab. It is a finite element open source code. And I wanted to use this velocity field that I have using a constant diffusion coefficient and see how the transport will take place in this domain. So I had lots of convergence issues. Why? Because in the cavity, the velocity is orders of magnitude higher compared to the matrix. And there is a significant difference in Peclet number in cavity and outside the cavity. So I couldn't converge this model. Then I had to assign a relatively higher diffusion coefficient to the cavity, which is non-physical, to make this work. And as you can see, this diffusion is so big. You see, it diffuses in the cavity immediately, and this is so non-physical. So here it was the time to think of how I can make use of these velocities and yes, Dr. Mojd.
Okay, could you explain again? So why did you have to overestimate the diffusivity in the cavity?
Because here the velocity was several orders of magnitude higher compared to the velocity in the matrix, and I had a more important Peclet number. The difference between Peclet number was significant. So the advective terms are, when they are more important, the diffusive terms, they are less important. I will have stability issues. So
Right.
we are more comfortable solving diffusion problem, but when it is advection diffusion, then it is very challenging numerically to take care of that.
Yeah, and now question, but because, I mean, and why again is the velocity within the cavity so much higher?
Because the cavity is void, it has no resistance in front of the fluid. So fluid gets to the cavity and goes to the end of cavity with no barrier in front of it. But in matrix, we have a porous system, which includes lots of solid grains, and it's in between the grains, the fluid has to flow. So we have a seepage flow in the matrix, and we have like free flow in the cavity.
Right, understood. However, but because the cavity is an inclusion that it's embedded within the flow, it seems to me in some sense, I mean, the flow has to come from somewhere and go somewhere. So
yes.
If it were a huge velocity in the cavity, it couldn't
it's not huge velocity. It is 1 or 2 orders of magnitude larger compared to the matrix. It's not very huge, and the pressure loss will be very small.
Pressure loss very small. Yeah, but then are you saying that the flow, I mean, that it must then be recirculating within the cavity at a very high rate, because it can't really be flowing from one end of the cavity to the other at a high rate, because it would have to go somewhere. When it leaves, it would enter the porous medium where it's slow.
That's true. A part of it will recirculate in the cavity, and a part of it will go through the main axis of cavity. I will show you in the next slide how it goes. But also, I can show it here. As you can see, this portion of the tracer is somehow going through kind of a straight line and passing through the cavity. But you see, this is reaching the end of cavity relatively faster compared to this front that is propagating through the matrix. So this difference is actually making an imbalance between the advective terms in cavity and in the porous matrix. That's what I'm talking about. And I couldn't overcome this imbalance unless I had to increase the diffusive term like in a non-physical way. So we used a semi-Lagrangian approach, since we know velocity like discrete, but everywhere in the domain. We can use the method of characteristics. So we go with the bulk fluid velocity, and once we are up over the fluid particles, we just do the diffusion term, right? That's what we do. So we find the characteristic curves by integrating the velocity field from one location to another, and then we just solve a diffusion problem at each location. At each location you are, what is the concentration of this tracer? It is the same as concentration of the previous point on the same path line in the previous time step, and it should be diffused at that location. That's the whole idea of what we are doing here. So using this semi-Lagrangian approach, I was able to use a finite difference method on a very coarse grid, 200 by 200, which is relatively a very coarse grid, on my laptop, which is a very, very non-performance laptop. And I was able to advect and diffuse this non-reactive tracer through the domain. As you can see, once the tracer reaches the cavity, it goes through the cavity. Some portions of the cavity, for example, these blue parts, are never touched by the tracer as much as the central area is. Let me show you in this spherical shape. What you see on this left side is where the matrix permeability is relatively lower compared to the right side of this line, if it is visible for you, I hope. Since here the permeability of matrix is lower, the diffusive term is comparable to the advective term. So you can see this diffusive front in the matrix that is showing somehow the advective terms and diffusive terms are comparable to each other. But for example, if we look into this case, you see a sharp interface on a 200 by 200 grid. This is a relatively interesting result at the edges, and we can see that the fluid passes through the cavity relatively faster compared to through the matrix. And also, when we have increasing slip conditions, some area in the cavity will not receive that much of tracer compared to the other area. And if you look into the breakthrough curves, you can see that the breakthrough happens in relatively earlier times when we have the higher permeability in matrix, and later in time when we have lower permeability in matrix. This is something that we expected. And also the breakthrough happens at lower values of concentration for the case that we have spherical shape for the inclusions compared to the more elongated shapes of the inclusions or cavities. With having the transport equations taken care of, I started to include some reactive transport in the system, and the aim was to see how the chemical reactions will be rearranged in this system when we describe the flow problem more accurately. So we coupled the transport problem with the chemical reactions. We studied the case of mineral dissolution in carbonate rocks. The results of this study was published in our paper in Physics of Fluid. I included the info here for you if you need to look into it in more details. So in a qualitative look, what we obtained was that we have definitely some reaction hotspots located around the cavity. And these reaction hotspots are mostly located upstream where the fluid enters the cavity and downstream where the fluid leaves the cavity. We have less mineral dissolution on the sides of the cavity. This is somehow a phenomena that we have seen it in the sinkholes, for example. The funnel shape of the sinkholes is somehow representing the same structure of location of the reaction hotspots around the cavity. We also noticed that the porous inclusions, they exhibit relatively different behavior in a reactive system. And we wanted to know how a porous inclusion is different from a fluid filled cavity in a more quantitative way. So what we started to do, we looked at the dissolution at the interface between the cavity and the porous matrix. So this red line, as you can see here, is the border of the cavity. It is like in the X direction. And at this border, we looked into how much mineral calcite, for example, is reduced from the rock, the matrix rock around this cavity. We looked into the reduction in calcite mineral when we have a porous inclusion and when we have a fluid-filled cavity. The porous inclusion is shown with this solid line here, and the fluid-filled cavities are shown with the dashed lines here. As you can see, all the cases show a significantly higher reduction in calcite mineral at the upstream and downstream where the fluid enters the cavity and leaves the cavity. But how these are different from the porous inclusion, it is completely related to the slip parameter. In general, the lower slip parameter shows a less reduction in calcite mineral compared to the in the fluid filled cavity compared to the porous inclusion. So in these black graphs here, I use the reduction in calcite mineral at each point of the border of the cavity as a reference value and compared to the rest with respect to this. As you can see here, when the cavity is more elongated, here the aspect ratio of the cavity is smaller. And as you can see here, the porous inclusion shows a higher reduction in calcite mineral compared to the fluid-filled cavity. And once the aspect ratio approaches 1 and the shape gets a spherical shape, we will see that the calcite mineral reduction from the fluid-filled cavity and the porous inclusion at upstream approaches each other. And at downstream, we see that the porous inclusion provides a higher reduction in calcite mineral compared to the fluid-filled cavities. In the graphs on the left-hand side, as you can see here, we are playing with the cavity being a porous inclusion or just a fluid-filled cavity with different slip parameters. As you can see, the porous inclusion provides an improved effective reaction rate compared to the fluid-filled cavities for all the different kinds of aspect ratios, like, for example, a very elongated cavity or a spherical cavity. This graph is showing same concept in another way. Basically, here we are having the same, for example, fluid-filled cavity or porous inclusion, and this time we'll play with the shape. And as you can see, the spherical shape is showing the best effective reaction rate compared to the other shapes. So, for example, the more elongated the cavity is, we have less effective reaction rate. Okay, the ending part of this talk will be about the anomalous transport in porous medium with embedded cavity, which is the title of my talk, and it's the very last slide actually. So now, since we have an accurate description of the velocity everywhere in the domain, we wanted to know if we can completely replace this model with some homogeneous medium and solve the advection diffusion equation in that homogeneous medium. Is such a thing like homogenization of this medium reasonable? So we looked into the transport of particles through Langevin model. And as you can see here, so here again, we have a cavity located at the center of the medium. 1/3 above, on top of the domain, the green particles, which they have no physical difference between each other, it's just the color, enters the domain. And in the middle third, we have red particles, and in last third, we have blue particles. As you can see, the red particles, they are all moved toward the very northeast, and the green particles as well, and the blue particles cover like an important portion of the downstream. So we started thinking of looking into this problem in a continuous time random walk framework, and then we looked into the probability density function for particle residence time and location. And as you can see, since this probability density function was in a compact form, we can describe it as a multiple of the PDF in space and PDF in time. And looking into the breakthrough curves in terms of the PDF function, as you can see here, we saw a curved power law function for the breakthrough curves at the location, at the downstream location. The blue dots here show it's like we have a late time tailing, an early time arrival in the domain, which represents an anomalous behavior here. This compared to a homogeneous porous medium, which is shown here in red dots, as you can see, it's we do not see that late time tailing here. So this model, which consists of a porous matrix and an embedded cavity, is exhibiting the anomalous behavior, and it can be described through a continuous random walk model or a fractional diffusion equation. So that was all about my talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rasulzadeh, for the nice presentation. So anyone, any question? Sure, Dr. Nisha.
Dr. Mitchell.
So a couple of questions, and stop me because I have a number, so I don't want to monopolize it. So as soon as you are the moderator, I think I've asked too many. Just go to somebody else, please. Okay. So the first question I had is, so when you talked about you had the Brinkman equation morphing between Stokes flow and Darcy flow, and then you had radically different coefficients in the two phases. Did I get that correctly?
In the cavity and the Darcy.
Yeah. So you said your Darcy Brinkman model. I'm wondering if you were. So one way is that, I mean, you have an interface, and up to the interface it's one, and the inclusion in the medium, and then in the inclusion something else. If you were to do this Darcy Brinkman model, and rather than make a jump discontinuity between the coefficients in the two phases, if you kind of smeared it out a little bit with some, what do you call it, mollifying parameter, and then gradually took the limit as you got to a sharper and sharper interface, what would happen?
So that is actually one of the approaches that people apply using Darcy Brinkman model. But usually numerically doing this is very complicated. It's not as straightforward as what we, for example, do in approaches like interface tracking methods like level set model. So I'm not sure if numerically it is possible to develop this.
Okay, understood. Another general comment. So I did a very interesting talk. I mean, you bring in, the fluid mechanics, the mass transfer, the reactions, it's all very interesting. And it strikes me that you could take your same methodology and apply it in, let's say, a biological area like transport through skin. Because skin of humans and animals, it's a multi-phase medium. You have cells, you have lipids, they have interfaces, different properties, and like the cells or other inclusions in the skin would be like your cavities. So it seems to me that that's an area ripe for the application of the kind of modeling you're doing.
Yes, and I suppose we will have some adsorption there, right?
Yes, you will. Yeah, as well. So that's just another general comment. The third question is, so can you describe again, how did you deal with multiple cavities? Because it seems like you also have several, spatial arrangements of them.
So we have linear differential equations. If I want to tell you like what happens in the math behind this problem, right? We have linear differential equations, and so we can superpose the results of these differential equation. So once you have the pressure field for one of these inclusions, you can superpose it with the pressure field from another cavity and obtain the pressure field for both of them.
Okay, understood. So then here's a question. This comes up. So when people, let's say, deal with a particle suspension, let's say, and you put let's just say you put a fluid suspension in shear flow, and then if it's a pure fluid, that would be like that would be the counterpart of an unobstructed porous medium, right? And then when you put in a particle, for example, if you were to hold the particle fixed against the flow, it would be flow streaming around. That would in Stokes that would be 1/r disturbance. But if you have a particle that's let's say freely suspended but not free to rotate, then that would give you like a rotelet disturbance, a little weaker decay. And then if you have a particle that's freely suspended and free to rotate, then you have a stresslet disturbance. And then you add them up over all the particles in there, you get the dissipation and you get the effective viscosity. So my question is, if you have an inclusion, let's say that's spherical versus elongated, what and compared to the bulk porous medium, what is the spatial decay of that? Because now you have an interface, you have a different transport process inside there. You see what I'm saying? So
right.
Viewed far away, what would be the order of the disturbance that you see from that inclusion?
Right. This is a very interesting question. Honestly, I never thought about it, but that's a very good question. So far what I am looking at is just the effective permeability. But what you're talking about is some non-local effect. This is not an easy question to answer, at least in my point of view. So you want to see how the presence of cavity brings some like memory effect to the domain because of this difference between the physical properties somehow between the cavity and the matrix, right?
Yeah, no, not necessarily a memory effect. Just so the point is, if you have, let's say, your species that's being carried along, let's say if it's pure diffusion or if it were in the case of flow, and then you can have already calculated the concentration distribution everywhere, which means you know how much and exactly in what way the presence of the inclusion perturbs the concentration distribution, or the pressure distribution. So
yes.
what I'm suggesting is you could characterize that disturbance, at least, far
Yes,
away from the inclusion in some way. Is it a 1/r? Is it a 1/r squared? Is it some coefficient as 1/r squared? Something like that. And
so I do not have a nice description as you mentioned here, but I looked into breakthrough curves when we have different shapes of the cavity. And I noticed that when we have more elongated cavity, the breakthrough happens at earlier times. So that is something that, for example, if we want to improve the transport properties of the domain, we need to have more elongated cavities compared to the less elongated cavities with a larger aspect ratio, for example.
And now when you say breakthrough, that implies a certain direction in relation to the shape of the cavity.
Exactly, yes.
Understood. Let's see. One other question or comment. Can you go back to your semi-Lagrangian method a little bit? Because it seemed to me that you were then talking about diffusion relative to the advection. Can you just describe it one more time?
So here we are solving an advection diffusion equation, right? So we can split this problem into two problems, advection problem and diffusion problem, right? And the advection problem is when we follow what is called the path lines. It's not the streamlines. We follow the path lines. And when we are up on the fluid, we see no advection because we are moving with the same velocity as the fluid. And what happens at each location is just how much this concentration will be diffused in the domain, right? So that is exactly what we are doing here. We are solving this advection diffusion equation through what is called the method of characteristics. So method of characteristics for the advection part is just advection of the bulk concentration with the same velocity through the domain. But here we have an additional diffusion that shows up there. It doesn't let the bulk concentration be transported, but also it diffuses at each time. But how can I find those path lines? Since I have the velocity field like analytically obtained, I can integrate it and I can obtain the path lines very easily. That's why we have a very efficient numerical model. We can deal with this problem in a finite difference scheme and with a relatively coarse grid for a complicated problem as such, and we can do the transitivity.
And the finite difference is for the diffusion problem, which is diffusion relative to the...
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, so very interesting. I might want to offer the following comment. So in addition, so you've sort of gone basically Lagrangian with regard to the fluid path lines. There are particle methods which basically they do that, meaning it's a deterministic method where you turn loose a certain number of particles, and if there were no diffusion, they would just follow the path lines. Right. But then if you put a certain very special kind of repulsion between the particles, they repel each other in exactly the way that is representative of diffusion. Mm-hmm. So then you just track the particles, and then if you want to count particle per volume or whatever, you can see where they go. You can get the diffusion part. But what's nice about it is the same thing what you have here is because your starting point is the fluid path lines, there's no upwind derivative that you'd have with a fully Eulerian method. You already just sidestep that whole issue by making your baseline the advection.
Yes, I hope so.
Yeah. Anyway, so if you're interested, I'd be happy to send you one paper where it combines the skin idea and this particle method idea, where we were tracking diffusion through skin, but it was with this particle method that was sort of based on advection, and it makes, yeah. Anyway, so I'd be happy to send it to you if you're interested.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Anyway, so it's very interesting. I mean, so many different facets of the talk, and it's all, I mean, all a very concrete problem, but then it fans out into these different phenomena applications. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So I have a question, Dr. Rasmussen.
Yes.
So have you ever used any kind of even very simple model, two-phase model on your?
So two-phase model will be relatively complicated in the cavity because modeling two-phase flow in porous media is quite straightforward, but in the cavity it will be complicated. One thing that we are working currently is replacing this cavity with equivalent porous inclusion and then take care of the two-phase problem. Because mainly on the interface of cavity and matrix, the problem will be extremely complicated. So using this approach that I presented here for two-phase, honestly, I may need to do some interface tracking approach, I don't know, or level set model, something like that to describe how the two-phase flow will happen in the cavity. But for the porous part, we are more comfortable to do two-phase flow. So one idea that I have for now is just replacing this with a porous inclusion. But first, we need to compare the results from a fluid filled cavity and porous inclusion, how they behave in two-phase systems. So it may require lots of numerical validation before that we can say these two are exactly the same.
And one more quick question. I think that the simulation that you apply is a macro scale simulation. So depending on the size of the pores, if we want to look at micro scale or even nanoscale, let's stick it in microscale, do you see any change in the physics, that any kind of terms that we have to take care of for the simulation? So what is your envision for regarding the difference of these two?
What I presented here is a mesoscale. It's something between the porous scale modeling and macro scale modeling. So we are in between, where we have the size of cavity larger than porous scales. So we can assume the matrix as a porous host, and the so for macro scale, like the reservoir scale or the scale of the porous medium itself, I have some, I know what to do because I know what is the flow field in detail at each grid point. So there is no problem for that. We can use some source terms and sig terms to represent the cavities easily there. But in terms of going down and somehow coupling Stokes flow in pore throats to a free flow in the cavities, that might be another challenging problem to work on.
So then another question that I have, sorry, it's maybe other audience have question. Do you have any experimental results to validate your results with experiment? I know that is very difficult because I have been working in this field a little bit, but
no, unfortunately, I do not have that much of experimental results. I have few reference publications that I validate my model against their results, and one of them has the experimental work presented for that, but no, I do not have any experimental results.
Any other questions, audience, from audience?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. Thank you again for this wonderful presentation. Lots of good discussion there. I know it's
Thank you.
We're coming from different angles, you know, some things, you know, even in the heat transfer, I always see things like different as perspectives. So this discussion will trigger, you know, more interesting research down the road. My question is you use, my understanding, you use this open source software to simulate.
Not everywhere, just here for transport, and then I wasn't successful in using that, then I had to use an in-house code. Yeah.
So so I guess we're also very interested in, you know, developing, not necessarily, you know, same thing like the mass transfer, like what transporting the cavity like you did, but in the additive manufacturing, right, there is those small particles, you know, there has been research using a discrete element method. You know, they're doing those particle powder interaction things. And also the other thing is when you think about those produced directly 3D printed parts, that has very rough surface, right? Sometimes there is this, it's not porous, but it's very rough. It has, you know, and in heat transfer, we're particularly interested in creating those small channels, you know, inside. So I just very interesting if we can, you know, for those small scale devices printed directly, if we kind of want to do some simulation, look at the heat and mass transfer inside those, maybe there's, I see some application what you are doing here, you know, just to be able to help.
So definitely for very elongated shapes, we can use this model either for the porous inclusions when we look into the heat equation, and for the cavity inclusions when we are looking into mass transport. Definitely this framework works for that. So with this spheroidal shape, we can cover all kinds of shapes, in particular the rod shapes that you are mentioning here. Yeah,
Okay.
it will be a very interesting application. And about the roughness, so about the roughness, I can easily, I hope. So I can include roughness on this surface. So this surface is introduced through a parameter like S0, okay? So I can say this S0 is S0 plus some epsilon as a function of the theta, the angle. So from one location to another location on this interface, I introduce this roughness on the surface, which is not a very large parameter, but still changes the shape, and still the same framework will apply. So including roughness is, I think it's a very interesting problem, and also it will be possible to do.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So whenever we are here, whenever here we introduce the boundary conditions on this S0, we always focus on that specific value we have. So we will have a system of multiple equations to solve, but that will not be very, very complicated to do.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for answering that.
Any other question? So just to let you know, Dr. Rasulzadeh, Dr. Shua and I are working in heat transfer. I knew that he's going to ask some heat transfer question. That's why I didn't ask heat transfer question.
Right.
That was exactly the same thing, because we are working exactly right now at what he's talking about. So that was very, very interesting. I would definitely follow on with you about this question that he asked. So we are very interested to collaborate with you, hopefully, on that. So any other question, audience? All right,
just to remind, just to remind everyone, please fill out the survey in the chat box to help us, better, provide those guest lectures in the future. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much, everybody.
I think that no one has questions. So again, thank you, Dr. Rasulzadeh, for a very nice and very, very informative presentation. I see lots of interest, and Dr. Nietzsche and Dr. Shua, I'm pretty sure students also are very interested. We definitely be in touch with you, and hopefully that would be a good starting point to start our collaboration.
Thank you so much. I look forward to it.
Thank you. I appreciate it again. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.